I was born in Nanking, China. I stayed all of 2 months because my parents were teaching at the Christian women's college called Jingling College in Nanjing, and that's actually where I was born. But because of the revolution, my parents only stayed 2 more months and then came back to the United States. My mother was born in Stockton, California, so she was a U.S. citizen, and so we were able to come over on a U.S. destroyer, and so I didn't have a problem coming back into the country.
And where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Stockton?
So I grew up so the first 2 years after coming over, we were in Oakland, and then we came down to Los Angeles. My father found a job, and so I grew up in Echo Park and Silver Lake.
And can you tell me a little bit about your family upbringing? Did you have siblings?
I have one sister. She's a little younger. And my mother and father, they were both trained as educators, but my mother taught in a junior college for a while, and then in a community college, and then she became an actress. So she was an actress for 50 plus years. And my father was an educator, but in those days, nobody was going to hire an Asian American as a college administrator. They would have allowed them to teach in like Chinese studies, but so he eventually opened his own business in import and had a successful business.
And you want to say something, we have to say something about your mother's career and what her name?
Beulah Kwoh, her stage name was Kwoh, and she was very influential in setting up the East-West Players. So she was one of the busiest Asian American women actors in the 70s and 80s, but really fought for jobs for Asian American actors in that period of time. So she was very busy. She was like the Democratic firebrand. My father was kind of a moderate Republican. So that's why I became a lawyer, is because we had a lot of arguments in the family. But it was a very, enriching time. My mother went to Berkeley, and then my sister went to Berkeley. But I wanted to go to UCLA, so I went to UCLA. Well, I think it's probably from my church. My church had some civil rights leaders in the church. My minister would go down south to demonstrate, almost got killed once or twice. And then I had an African American Sunday school teacher who was opened my eyes to what was happening in the world. So I think that plus the civil rights movement was so powerful, it was hard not to understand the fight for African Americans. And then as it related to Asian Americans, I started making the connection between like the war in Vietnam and Asian American oppression here. And so I was trying to connect the dots as I went into UCLA. And then when I went into UCLA, I had all the experiences, the Asian American Studies Center, being head of the Asian Student Association, being part of a fraternity. So I tried everything and really found a place with the Asian American Studies Center. In the history, I remember once the Studies Center was set up, I was the first, I forgot if we called it the college community liaison. And so I tried to liaison to different community groups in, for example, Chinatown and Little Tokyo. And so that was really eye-opening as well.
So can you tell me a little bit more about connecting the dots and the connection of those dots to ethnic studies?
Well, so for example, I noticed on May 5th, 1970, there was a big demonstration opposing it was really the Cambodian invasion by U.S. troops, and the president lied about it. And at that time, I was president of the UCLA Asian American Student Association. And so we actually had a big rally. So it was the students, there were some students who later got arrested, but they were all at our rally. And I brought Warren Furtani onto campus to be the kind of the agitator. And so we had a nice rally. And at that time, because there were several student demonstrations, it was before the National Guard came onto the campus, we had our rally of several hundred students in front of Campbell Hall. And so I was always trying to bridge the community with the college issues. And so Warren spoke about how it was connected, how the oppression of Asian Americans linked to the fight in Vietnam and Cambodia.
There was a big demonstration at Drake Stadium. Do you have any recollection of that? Warren was speaking at that event.
On that day?
I don't know if that's on that particular day,
Mm.
but it was Drake Stadium looked filled with people.
Mm.
Warren was at the podium speaking. It was an anti-war protest.
Hmm. Well, there were so many different demonstrations and speeches at that time, some by off-campus people, some by students. It was hard to keep track of.
What other experiences or what other events were taking place? You mentioned the civil rights movement, the war in Southeast Asia, the anti-war movement. Were there other things that were influential on your thinking and growth, intellectual and political growth?
Well, I worked with people, Dr. Philip Wong and Yuji Ichioka, to think through how Asian American studies could come to UCLA. We always felt that the students in Northern California took the brunt of the physical activities and physical beatings to try to fight for Asian American studies. But I remember meeting with them to plot out how to get the study center going at UCLA. So that was very enriching because I learned so much from them. I learned how to write from people like Yuji because it wasn't in the classes at UCLA, but it was trying to communicate with the students, and especially as the president of the UCLA Asian Student Association. At that time, there were very few Asian American student associations, so we were the main group. I think it was the Asian American Student Alliance or something like that. But anyway, there was only one really main group, and so it was that was an opportunity I got to learn how to write from Yuji, how to communicate. So that was really fantastic. But I think what was most meaningful is when the study center started the classes. I remember hearing Philip Veracruz, seeing him come onto campus, hearing the story about the Filipino farm workers, and how inspiring it was to hear about their stories and how they really started the union. And that was the most meaningful part, is when we started hearing about these stories. And then later, people like Fred Korematsu and others came onto campus to talk about their stories. And so it made Asian American studies alive. It really helped us understand what these heroes went through when they didn't even have the support of their own community, but they fought for justice, they fought for what they thought was right, and what they thought was right. And so it was very helpful to understand that perspective of life.
So what did that do to you personally?
Well, I thought it was inspiring because it really showed that Asian Americans had a role in U.S. society, but you had to speak up. That nobody was going to give us something because we were entitled to uh, anything. They had to speak up, they had to fight, and I think that was a really good role model, which I later saw in my parents as well, especially my mother. But it's something that I learned that if you don't speak up, if you don't advocate for your community's rights, nobody's really going to pay attention. So when the study center was set up, I became the community liaison. And so that was meaningful because what we were trying to do is we were trying to figure out how the university could be of assistance for the struggles in the community. And so I remember I was participating with the tutorial program in Chinatown. Later on, when I went to law school at UCLA, it was, how do we set up legal service programs in Little Tokyo and Chinatown and other communities. So it was always that connection that was very important to me. In fact, that was where I was, I was supposed to do law review at UCLA Law School, but I knew I had to set up these programs, so I felt that should take priority over, doing more academic work.
Can you give me a little bit of a sense of the timeline, like when you came to UCLA, what year, when you got involved in Asian American Studies, and when you graduated, what you did after? Was it law school straight after graduation?
Okay, so I went to UCLA in 1966, and I got involved with fraternities and just acclimating myself to UCLA the first 2 years. Then I think the second year I got involved with the Asian American Studies Center, and there's some overlap, and then got very involved in that. And then by 1969, 1970, that's when I was president of the UCLA Asian American Student Association. And so that's when I worked with people like Yuji and Philip, was the community liaison. And then I went one extra quarter because of the anti-war activity. Then I went to Hong Kong for 6 months to study language, and then started UCLA Law School in 1971. And then, Actually, what was interesting was that during that period on May 5th, when the students got arrested, I was trying to get them out of jail. And so I called Judge Delbert Wong, who is a close family friend, about how to bail the students out. Anyway, in that process, I decided, I was a pre-med major, I decided I'd go to law school instead of med school. So it's a transformative time.
So that moment.
Yeah, because so what happened that day was we had our rally, and then at some point, the National Guard charged the building. And so we said, okay, let's go into the rooms and lock them. And we went into the upstairs rooms and locked them, and saw the khakis walking back and forth. And we heard a big commotion. And later on, we found that some American Indian brothers were beaten up. There was blood all over the steps. And we were on the top floor of Campbell Hall. And so that was like, frightening because we could have all gotten killed. But it was really eye-opening to us all in terms of the fight for civil rights as well as against the war. And so that experience that lasted more than a day helped me change my mind to apply to law school.
We're glad you did. The Asian American Student Association that you mentioned, because we're trying to reach out to other people involved in that. Are there other people that you remember being
Uh,
the core of that organization?
well, Alan Nishio was involved. Is it Marianne? Marianne was involved. I forgot her last name. Mary Lynn, yeah, Hirano. Mary Lynn Hirano, yeah. They were both involved. I remember Alan was involved. And so that was a learning time to connect with the community as well as to get students more involved. But I remember that was, we had that big rally at UCLA.
Against the war.
Mm-hmm.
Were there protests specifically for ethnic studies? Do you remember?
Well, that was where I was saying that, a lot of the protests for ethnic studies were more muted than what was happening in San Francisco and the Bay Area. So we were able to kind of utilize the struggles that the other students went through to kind of negotiate what would happen at UCLA. So I don't think there were, mass rallies.
For ethnic studies?
Yeah, for ethnic studies at UCLA. But there were meetings, a lot of meetings, but I don't think there were mass rallies.
That was my sense. I just wanted to get
Yeah.
confirmation about that. So when you were in law school, can you tell me more about your role in setting up legal services and how that work led to the Asian American Legal Center?
Yeah, so we set up this group called the Asian Law Collective, and the idea was to, bring legal services to the communities. I helped to set up the programs in Chinatown and Little Tokyo. And then when I graduated, we worked with students from UCLA, USC, Loyola to set up the Asian Law Collective. And we were not funded by the government. We were just doing a kind of a private legal services. And so after a few years, I decided we could really get public support, but needed to be a nonprofit, tax-exempt organization. And so that was kind of a different journey because we'd first started off being very purist, not having any government links or controls over what we could do. But essentially, we were a private law firm in the community, charging small fees for the work we were doing.
Okay. So he'll cover it again, but we're going to back up a little bit. Okay, ready? Okay.
So in 1974, that's when I graduated. And then we decided to start the Asian Law Collective as a community office. So 4 years later, then there was this big case where people were killed, and then I had some experience with civil rights, so I decided to help on that case. And then
Can you talk a little more about the case?
so there were 5 people who were killed in North Carolina by the Ku Klux Klan and American Nazis, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was caught instigating the killings, but the police were eventually convicted or were held liable for the wrongful death. And so I worked on that for a few years, and then I decided I would want to come back to help set up a more publicly supported organization. and the Asian Pacific American Legal Center was born out of that process in 1982. So I rounded up people like Cass Tolentino, Judy Chu, and others to be part of our first board. And then we started the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. I was the only staff person. And today we have over 105 staff, over 800 volunteers, and 30-something board members. So we've grown a lot. We've become the largest Asian American civil rights group that's ever existed. But that journey started with myself in 1983. It's actually the same year that I noticed the Asian Americans in the Law course was started at UCLA. So I've taught that course since 1983 as well, or co-taught it. And so that was, our journey here meant I had to learn how to be responsive to different issues like the 1992 riots or other big events in the history of the city, and have Asian Americans play a role in either the rebuilding of the city or helping the city grow. So that was something I learned in our growth, is you have to be responsive. You have to be responsive. The second thing I would say is that we always were multi-ethnic in our viewpoint. We were mainly helping Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but we wanted to have a multi-ethnic perspective on how we were going about our work. So I think others appreciated that kind of perspective because it was refreshing. We weren't just out for ourselves, but of course we were always trying to help Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders at the same time. And then I think I learned about how to raise money and how we can advance ourselves through understanding how to raise money in the nonprofit sector. And so in that sense, in the 1990s, I learned how to get into foundations. So I actually became a board member of 5 or 6 different foundation boards all at the same time. So that was a little bit too much, but I became chair of the California Endowment, which is a $4 billion health foundation, and others. But so I really started understanding how things worked in the foundation world, and then how it could help the minority communities. I tried not to get funding for ourselves while I was on the board, but it definitely helped me understand how to get funding. And I would say, we were able to draw very talented people from places like UCLA, but I was always trying to get the top talented people to make a commitment for the community. And so I think those are the reasons why we've been successful. And we've gotten some big donors as well as small donors, and we've been able to have this long journey.
Is there anything else in terms, by the way of lessons in community building and institution building, that you feel you gained from your experience that you would like to share?
Well, I think that community building is one aspect, and then I think the institution building is another aspect. I think with the community, we always wanted to be situated where we were helping multiple communities. We didn't want to just help the first people there. We wanted to make sure the strong helped the weaker and the larger helped the smaller. So for example, during the riots during 1992, maybe we started with 1 or 2 Korean American staff, but within 2 years we had 8 or 9. And so we were always trying to figure out, well, how could we be of real assistance to the community? So I think in terms of community building, we established that we were there for everyone, and we had a philosophy of helping the most vulnerable. And I think that came from understanding our history, where the stronger didn't always help the weaker, but we had to learn how to do that and do that well, because that would help us in the community building, but help us show people that that's what we were about. And then I think institution building, that was the trek where we had to learn how to raise money, and raise money from people who didn't normally fund Asian Americans. So that was a different, slightly different track, because most of the money didn't come from our own community. Later on, it started coming from our own community, which I think is the challenge for the future, is how do we tap the resources from our own community and do that really well. I think it's still a challenge, and people learn that the donors within the Asian American community are like every other community. They're very particular about what they're giving to, but they won't give to everything. So you have to really understand what is their motivation in order to tap their generosity.
I know we're getting close to the time we have to go.
Oh, yeah, no, go ahead.
The Asian Pacific American Legal Center, and now Advancing Justice, has relationships with many other community organizations, institutions, and leaders across the country. Can you talk a little bit more about how you viewed the role of the Legal Center and Advancing Justice, kind of in relationship to that kind of ecosystem?
Sure. Well, in the first big case that we worked on was the Vincent Chen case, and that was also in 1983 when the sentencing occurred. And as people know, Vincent was killed by two white auto workers thinking he was Japanese, thinking he was a foreigner, and was killed. His sentencing was totally unjustified. The two killers got home on probation and a $3,000 fine, which still to this day outrages everybody I can talk to. But at any rate, what we learned about that institutionally was that we didn't have the power and we didn't have the resources to send people to the cities where the trials were taking place to try to figure out how to put more pressure on the court system for justice. So that was a big lesson as to how to build up our legal resources to enable us to put pressure on the court system. So in the 1980s, I felt, at the latter part of the 1980s, I felt we should build a national organization as well that could respond to like national cases like that happened in Detroit, Michigan with Vincent Chen, because that definitely was not one of the top 10 population centers for Asian Americans. So I had this idea. I had to reach out to the other legal groups, and eventually I did with the help of people like Dolly G. And so we formed the what is now called the Asian American Justice Center. It's a smaller group, maybe 20 people now, but they were able to, we defined them as national, and so the Asian Law Caucus, Asian Pacific American Legal Center, and ALDEF in New York formed the organization. So that exists today. And so I think that was one good move to try to be able to be responsive to what was happening in different parts of the country. Then in 2013, it took 8 years before 2013, but um, I realized that what was happening in the community is that there was a tremendous growth in the community. And eventually, each community would want their own legal centers. But the problem was they would all have a different name. They would all have a different brand. They would all compete for the same sources of funding. So about 8 years before 2013, I went on a campaign with the legal groups and said, we've been working together for quite a while, but because we have a different name, nobody knows we're working together. So I was able to convince the boards and the staff. It took 7 or 8 years, but by 2013, we agreed to rename ourselves Asian Americans Advancing Justice with a tagline that indicated who we were before or our geographic location. And I think that has been very helpful to, so there's 5 groups now in Atlanta, DC, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles that all have the same name. And so people kind of know who to reach out to. They know Asian Americans Advancing Justice is there, even though it might be LA or Atlanta or, and so I feel that that has also helped us centralize and establish a common brand. So I would say I've learned the institutionalization from experiences our own community has had. We didn't start as one national group. We didn't have the either capability or the willingness to combine, but sooner or later, by having a common brand, I think we are stronger that way. And then we have national coverage. And now as the organizations in our 5 group partnership have grown, we're able to cover different parts of the country, even if we don't have an office there. In our Los Angeles office, we have established offices in Orange County, Sacramento, and we have a small office in the San Gabriel Valley. So we have spread out as well to try to cover the communities in Southern California, which is still the biggest community of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the country. So I would say, we've tried to learn the lessons from institutionalization as well as community building to apply it to our community, ideally in creative ways and helpful ways, so that people know who we are and that we're there for them.
Well, you've certainly done an amazing job.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're proud that we're the largest Asian American legal group, but we are one of the largest legal groups in Los Angeles. And so, as I indicated earlier, our multicultural, multi-ethnic perspective means that, for example, on DACA, we help 70% plus Latino students. But on citizenship, we help 70% plus Asian Americans. So it just depends what the program is. But now we try to help everyone with a focus on Asian Americans. Yeah, I think one of the big incidents at UCLA was where I brought together the Asian American students and some community members to protest against the invasion by American troops in Cambodia. And so that was very life transforming because I helped students get out of jail. But that made me decide to apply for law school instead of med school. So that was a huge one. I think when I qualified for law review at UCLA, there was an aha moment that I had to realize the reason I went to law school was to help people, not to help myself, and that I needed to really pay attention to how we would be able to set up legal service programs in Chinatown or Little Tokyo and other Asian communities at that time. And so I think those were very meaningful. I think when we think about the work at the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, we started a multi-ethnic leadership program right before the riots in 1992. So we had a program ready to roll after the riots. And so I think that was very timely, but that indicated that we were thinking ahead of the times, even though we weren't able to stop the riots. I think we were able to see in the so-called welfare reform that the welfare reform would be turned around. This was under President Clinton, that it would attack immigrants. And sure enough, 44% of the cutbacks during that period of time were aimed at immigrant programs because they couldn't fight back. And so we had a coalition that was ready that fought against those changes in the welfare system. So in essence, what I'm saying is that programmatically we were ahead of the curve, thinking through what was going to happen in the U.S. Economy and in the political system that would perhaps attack immigrants, perhaps attack people of color. And we tried to think ahead of time to figure out what to do about it. And so I think we have been recognized as being creative and sometimes forward-thinking in our work, but always having a multiracial perspective. I read a book recently that, there was, during the affirmative action battles, people said, well, how did blacks help us? Or how did Latinos help us? And I remember when we first started celebrating the Martin Luther King holiday, this young Chinese reporter said, why should we celebrate this? And I asked him, well, when did his family come to the United States? And it was after 1970. And I said, well, but for the Civil Rights Movement, you wouldn't be here today. Because of the Civil Rights Movement, we were able to change the immigration laws. But even before that, there were chapters of the NAACP who stood against the internment or the concentration camps for Japanese Americans. And in 1869, there was an eloquent spokesperson who was asked what should they do with the Chinese who had stayed beyond building the railroads. And he said they should become citizens. They should be allowed to vote. They should be the same as everybody else. And that person was Frederick Douglass. So there's a history of other minorities acting in solidarity with us. We have to learn how to act in solidarity with others, because it's the only way that Asian Americans will be able to get ahead in American society is by being strong, certainly looking out for our own interest, but also combining our fight with other people's fights.